So this also fits in the general, as I said, mood of the time with the fin de siècle sort of gloomy mood about phenomena of degeneration in societies, but it also coincides with the rise of statistics, right? I had mentioned that the state infrastructure of collecting demographic and economic data was an important precondition for modern sociology to arise, and the kind of statistics that Durkheim could mobilize on suicides were available because modern states had made them, had asserted them, made them available, um, and they could be used also by sociologists such as Durkheim. Durkheim wrote at a time when the correlation coefficient was just about in the making by Karl Pearson, and didn't use this correlation coefficient. The maximum that you will find in the suicide are in a way cross tables. Yeah? So Durkheim in a way made use of cross tables, even with a third variable control for analyzing his data. Why did Durkheim then pick the suicide? Okay, it was a topic of the day. People noticed that it was rising in the societies. It's also a phenomenon difficult to understand. But for Durkheim, it was particularly interesting because he wanted to make a case against a purely individualistic take on suicides. So he wanted to argue against purely psychological explanations of suicide. And well, the prior when thinking about suicide is probably that there is hardly a more individualistic thing than the reasons that bring a person to committing suicide. And this is why for Durkheim, in a way, it was a very hard case to motivate a collectivist, a sociological explanation for this phenomenon. Yeah. So he starts with this observation that suicide rates correlate with religion. So that there are certain associations between regions and or countries' religious affiliations and suicide rates, which Durkheim finds puzzling. And a second striking observation is also that the regions or countries ranking in suicide rates are relatively stable over time. So we may not have seen this in the prior graph where the curves often cut across each other, but Durkheim does not only look at the European suicide rates, and in the 19th century, when you look here again at the graph, there's a relative stability, at least, of the country ranking. So France is always here on top of the Scandinavian countries. But Durkheim also looks at the regions or départements in France. And there seems to be a striking persistence then of suicide rates. So even though all of the individuals are replaced one generation after the next, there seems to be something in the social fabric of these regions that make some regions more likely to be high suicide regions than others. The final motivation for Durkheim was also that he noticed a rise in suicide rates after moments, not of individual crises, but in moments of moral crises. So Durkheim then was able to gather regional data from 3 different countries, including France, and country level data. So there are also maps being used in the book of Europe and different regions than in some of these countries. Then his nephew, actually, Marcel Mauss, whom you may know as the famous sociologist who wrote the book about the gift or gift giving, also provided individual suicide files in the 20th century, but this was not available to Durkheim at the time. So before actually describing the data, Durkheim already came up with a typology of different suicides, which you may have seen already, with the most important distinction being the one between the egoistic kind of suicide and the altruistic suicides, where altruistic suicides occur, for instance, in societies or contexts of what Durkheim considers over-integration. So where an identification of the individual with the societal norms are strongest. And this may happen in cultures where widows commit suicide after their husband's death, or it may also occur in wars and in army contexts where suicide is basically also used as a weapon, or where suicide is used also in the times of defeat, where an individual identifies so strongly with the defeat of his or her country that he or she commits suicide as a reaction. And this is different from the egoistic suicides, according to Durkheim, where it's rather an under integration of the individual in society that produces the suicide. So, for instance, and we will see this in a second, but the modern individual, the Protestant individual, left alone by, let's say, a strong religious community, is under integrated and tends to commit egoistic suicide. This in turn is a little bit different from the anomic suicide, which happens rather as a reaction to economic crises and in times of under-regulation. So when society is not sufficiently regulated, there's a fourth residual kind of type that fatalistic suicide, which happens when societies are over-regulated. But for Durkheim, this is more of a theoretic construct and not necessarily a real kind of type. So Durkheim's style of argumentation is similar again. He first of all wants to rule out existing explanations of why suicides occur to then present his own explanation. So at the time there were let's say pre-scientific kind of organic psychic explanations. There were explanations based on the social environment, right? Not least, I don't know, the cold Scandinavian climate producing suicides. And there was also the prominent explanation by his fellow early sociologist and competitor Gabriel Tarde, who saw the principle of imitation at the heart of many social phenomena. And when you think about suicide, this is probably even a very plausible explanation. In suicide research nowadays, there's also a phenomenon called the Werther effect. So Werther being, again, one of Goethe's novels, in which the main protagonist then of the novel, at the end of this, it's a novel in letters, commits suicide. And the book was a bestseller back in the 19th century. And following the publication of the novel, there was a wave of suicides across Europe. And this is referred to as the Werther effect, meaning there was, in a way, an imitation of the main outcome of the novel in real society. The Werther effect has also been studied in suicide research in more modern times, right? What happens when famous celebrities commit suicide? Do members of a given society commit more suicide? And there is some evidence that the Werther effect actually exists, but Durkheim rather wanted to argue against such let's say, a relational and any kind of individualistic explanation of suicide, mainly by pointing out these unexplained, strange persistencies of suicide rates and rankings.